Welcome back, everybody, to another edition of Straight Outta Flushing. It's your boy Dexter Henry with my guy Tyler Ward. Mets with an off day here this week. It's been an interesting time around the Mets. We've talked a lot about prospects, Wardy, the last couple of weeks. We've been talking about the young players in the Mets. We had a really fun episode in the last one, if you missed it, about Carson Bench and Nolan McLean and the Mets young players and who could be a front runner for NL Rookie of the Year. But I thought today, we both thought that we should talk about, I don't want to call this Wardy's boy. I'm not going to put this person on him. But we're going to talk about the Mets interim manager, Andy Green. Now, you look at the job Andy Green has done, Tyler, particularly since the trade deadline, right? Where a lot of guys went out, and you can look at a team like the Mets and say, well, what are they going to do? Are these guys going to play hard? Are they going to just play out the string? That has not been the case. We've talked about this the last couple of weeks. There's been kind of a new energy around this team. You had, I'm going to be nice here, you were critical at points, my friend, of Carlos Mendoza and his approach. And I don't want to make this completely a Mendoza versus Andy Green thing, but it's hard to not talk about it. Because Mendoza was fired this season and Green's now come in. I guess I'll start with this. How much credit do you think Andy Green deserves for the way this Mets energy has turned around? We know the Mets are not going to the playoffs, but the energy is different, right? How much credit do you give Andy Green for that? How much credit should we give a manager for that?
Well, Dex, I think all the way back to April of this season, right? When we were about 2.5, 3 weeks in. And that's when I already had began the discussions with you to suggest the Mets should part ways with Carlos Mendoza. And something that happened during that time was we saw, of course, the Red Sox part ways with Alex Cora and the Phillies part ways with Mr. Thompson. And in doing so, we saw in real time throughout the ensuing weeks to months after the fact how both those teams were able to rally around a different voice and a change in direction from what was previously bestowed upon them from their prior managers. This is a trend that we have seen almost very consistently across the game, especially the past half decade, with managerial firings mid-season, early season, and really helping a team get out of maybe a rut that they would have continued to dig themselves in should they have stayed with the same manager. Now, is a manager at fault for everything? No, but there's a reason as to why it's a ticking time bomb for many guys when that voice finally becomes stale across the clubhouse, the locker room, on-field, off-field, etc. So when that was all first happening, we were saying to ourselves naturally, it wouldn't hurt the Mets by having a change of voice and a change of direction, because it's not like Mendoza was this massive needle mover as a manager during his time here. He was far from that, unfortunately. So Andy Green comes into place, and what have we seen? It's exactly the same trend as these other interim managers. It really feels like almost no matter who that manager is, in almost every setting of every team that makes this midseason change, they find themselves with the same exact outcome. They get hot. They get on a wave. They play loose. They play fun. And they play with far more charisma and I think a positive attitude that is infectious across the team. I mean, Francisco Lindor just 48 hours ago stated himself how it's so infectious as to what the clubhouse is right now, how everyone's really rallying around one another. And you can tell that they are not at all pressing in the ways that they were earlier this year. Does it go in hand with season expectation? Absolutely. Knowing that we're post-trade deadline now, knowing what the fate of the club is, I think makes it easier for these guys to just go out and play the baseball that they want to play, because they know that the outcome doesn't really matter too much in the end, right? With a month and a half left this season. But does Andy deserve credit? Absolutely. How can you not give the man credit for the way that, above all, the way that he just articulates himself, Dex? I mean, I feel like we could do an hour-long pod as is, and just how contrasting Andy Green is, and not only how he speaks to media, but clearly how he speaks to these players. From one former player to another, from Mendoza to Green, it's so fascinating how contrasting they can be, and not only how they articulate themselves, but ultimately how they get their voice across and heard by the team as a whole. So throwing it back to you, what has impressed you the most about Andy Green as Mets interim manager? Because at the time I was talking right now, the Mets have been playing above 500 ball with him this season, right? They've won 13 of their past 20 games. They've been playing far more competent and far more entertaining than any other point this season. And, the roster hasn't drastically changed throughout that time, from the time Mendoza was parted with to Green being here. So how can you not look at Andy and say, yeah, it's pretty obvious that he's clearly helping this team trend in the right direction?
Yeah, look, to me, there's no way you can't not give him credit, right? I'm not going to be the person not give him credit. I also will curb my enthusiasm slightly because while I do want to give him credit, I think some of the points you brought up about the fact that where the Mets are in the season, sometimes players playing loose, not just when there's a manager change, but at this late in the season, there isn't that much to play for, so they can play free. Well, it begs the question, and I'm not saying, and this we'll get into this more. I'm not saying that he could not help the team in another situation. We saw what happened with the Phillies with Don Manley taking over and how their season turned around. What I will say though is it's one thing to be a manager of a team where there are no expectations anymore. It's another thing to manage a team when there is expectations. Sometimes your voice has to become a little bit different. But with that all being said, let's just look at what we have in the here and now and what we're talking about. You're talking about a team that is 13-7 in their last 20 games. You're talking about a team that has had some clutch wins. You're talking about a team where you've seen the offense come to life at times, sometimes win games with their defense. We saw that with the Mets game against San Diego last week. We've seen different ways they can win. That's things I always look for with any team in any sport through regular season, particularly a long regular season like baseball. Are you learning to win in different ways? The thing that has impressed me the most, to answer your question, with Andy Green, I said this even I think in July, was that the fact that he is willing to experiment with different guys, put them in different situations, see what they have, and see how they could develop. I even loved what he's done with my boy, Kodai Senga. Hey, it's last chance baseball for Kodai Senga. Let's see what you got out the pen. Let's see what you have in this closer's role. I know Devin Williams went down, but let's see what you've got here. And the results have overwhelmingly been positive. Still pretty small sample size, but overwhelmingly it has been positive with Kodai Senga. I think just empowering guys the way he talks about guys, you talked about communication. And some fans are going to be very different on this. Some fans do not care about what the manager says or how he delivers it in a post-game presser, and they don't think that stuff matters. I completely disagree. I think it matters, not just for the media, but it matters for the players in terms of leadership and how they see you going about and talking about the team and handling different situations. How are you going to handle it when a player's struggling? Are you going to be honest? Are you going to keep it a buck? Are you going to be real? Or are you going to kind of skirt the issue? Are you going to be willing to talk about a player when he's not playing well and say, hey, this guy has to be better? We know it's coach speak and manager speak, Wardy, for sometimes coach, hey, it's on me. I got to do a better job of preparing my players. But we all know sometimes that isn't true. We know that it comes down to players have agency, players have to execute. Yes, managers have to try to put them in the best possible situations, but players have to execute. One of the things I've liked about Andy Green in his communication style, to your point, is that he will talk about that and the execution of it. And either you're getting it done or you're not getting it done. I'm very much an accountability person. That is kind of how I believe about
I
things in
think you
life.
know I am too, Dex.
Yeah, that's how I rock with things in life. And I think whether it's me, whether it's you, we all make mistakes. None of us are perfect. We should be held accountable. I know you want to talk about some comments here, and I'm, we just heard Andy Green the other day have a blunt response about Mark Vientos when asked about him coming back and will there be opportunities for Vientos. And Andy Green, to sum this up, pretty much was like, he's going to have to take the at-bats that he gets and do the most that he can with him. And we'll see. There are no free lunches out here with Andy Green. And I love this. I love it, right? Especially for where this team is. Disappointing season for the Mets. We all agree this. We all agree with this. It's an absolute disappointing season for the Mets. But you can't have free lunches when you're looking at a team where you're trying to out what next good Mets team going to look like, who this is going to be. This was Andy Green's quote to about Mark Vientos. He said, I don't know. When he asked about Mark Vientos' impact returning from injury, he said, I was very forthright with him when he started the rehab assignment that a lot will be dictated by how others perform and by also how he performs. And I love that. And I even like the fact that he let the media know, Wardy, that he is being direct and forthright with his players, not just, him being forthright with us in the media and telling us something that might be a good quote or something that we might bring up on this podcast. It's not about that, right? He's telling us that he's talking to the players directly. And the last thing I'll say is I think what you want out of any coach and any manager is you want someone who's going to be honest with their players. You want someone who's going to know how to communicate with their players, because I think the most underrated part of management, this is, and again, I always talk about sports, it's a job. The most underrated part of management, Wardy, is the communication aspect, the motivation aspect, and being able to deal with different personalities. It is not just the X's and O's. It is not just the strategy on the field. It is so much more than that. And listen, I think because of Andy Green's background in player development, I do think that gives him an advantage or a leg up in this situation in terms of his communication style. Does that mean he'll be the best manager for the Mets if he were to stay in the dugout? I don't know, but I am impressed with the way he's gone about things so far.
As you were breaking this all down, it popped perfectly in my head. To look at Andy Green and the way that he has articulated himself reminds me a lot of my time as a student and the contrast in having, say, a teacher or professor that was strictly in the textbook, where every verbiage that
Mm,
they stated was pretty much exactly what you expected and was going to be the same response each time. Whereas with Andy, he's that kind of guy where you walk in the classroom and you're actually looking forward for class to start, because he's going to be not only straightforward with everyone as to what they can expect, but he's also going to reward you at the end for doing well, and that's a key takeaway that I've noticed with Andy, the emphasis that as long as you perform, you are not only going to continue to get opportunity, but we're going to maybe put you in positions that you haven't previously been in. It makes me think of his quote that he had regarding the September call-ups, about specifically
mm,
guys who have earned the right to be here, not just people who are getting the call for the sake of needing a new fresh arm. I love the way that he broke that down and stated, going back to his previous managerial days back in the 2000s of the Padres, how they operate in that fashion, that it did not lead to long-term success. So like
mm.
learning already from those past mistakes with things that were clearly out of his control, right? Because he stated it in a manner that suggested that it wasn't necessarily something that he wanted to do, but something that he had to do because, again, the front office made him essentially do it. So, in every way that Andy has stated how he views things from a managerial standpoint, from the Mark Vientos quote, who I can't get enough of, to even the quotes about Francisco Lindor on over the past week when Lindor had a walk-off hit for the Mets. And prior to that, Lindor had a costly base running blunder that could have costed the Mets the game. So Lindor
Mhm.
basically righted his wrong. And you see Andy saying that's what championship caliber players do. They're able to, of course, get out of that rut, fix the mental error, and of course, have that type of execution in the end. He's like, that's what you want in a championship type player. And then there's a laundry list of different quotes that we can emphasize here with Andy, but I think the point still stands. He has absolutely been a breath of fresh air, not only for this team, but for the fan base and for talking heads, media like you and I. It is so refreshing. Andy makes me want to look forward to attending one of his pressers before the season ends, if not multiple. I can't say that was the case with Carlos Mendoza, nor has that been the case at any point in the season with someone like David Stearns. Nothing personal against them, but you guys get what I'm trying to say. When you know it's going to be the same cliche answers every single time, it's pretty, redundant, and there isn't much reason to actually physically be present. Whereas Andy, you actually don't know what you're going to get each day, because he's clearly
Right.
going to have his way to break down his personal point of view and not maybe what a paper was slipped to Carlos Mendoza under the table to say in a 3-word sentence. So I'm very happy that the Mets did the move that they did with him. It would have been great if they did it sooner, but again, we're not going to beat that drum. I beat it for months on end this year as is. So I guess now here's what lies the question, Dex.
Mhm.
With Andy having the success that he has had and clearly has articulated himself in a way that's resonating well with this club, what do you think that means for the future of him in this organization?
Yeah, and what I feel like what you're asking in that is dugout or front office. What's kind of the better place? Where's he more valuable? Is what I'll say. Where's
Right.
Andy Green more valuable? Right. And I know you've seen this too on your platform and us talking here. There's and talking to fans. There's fans that are like, hey man, let's keep this thing going. Let's keep Andy Green as the manager of the New York Mets. Now, all indications from places who've done reporting on this. Chelsea James with SNY just wrote a really good piece on this too. So did Will Salmon from The Athletic
Shout out, Will.
about Andy Green, both different things. And one of the things you're hearing on both sides from their reporting is that all indications are still that he's going to go back up to the front office. Now we'll get to what that looks like in a second, but there's argument for his value as a manager for all the things we just wax poetic about here, right? There's argument for his value in the dugout and how he connects, but there could also be value for him in the front office. Now, I think if he goes back to the front office, I think because of this experience, I don't think he can go back to the same role in player development that he had before. I do think that there could be more value for him. I'm going to put a pin in that because we'll get to that. But I do think his future will be back, as you're hearing from all regards, will be back in the front office. Now, Steve Cohen has said if he's interested, he will be part of the managerial search. Do I think he deserves an interview and being part of that managerial search? Absolutely. He is absolutely, positively, 100% earned himself if he wants it. And you've talked about this before, if he talks to his family, if this is something he wants to do, if he wants the managerial life, he has absolutely earned himself a shot at an interview to lead this club. I think his voice would be more valuable in the front office. I will get into more of what role I think that could be, and I think you and I might agree on what that role could look like. But I think he could be more valuable in the front office, and something you were seeing in the reporting of Will Salmon and Chelsea James is the talk of the Mets wanting some more baseball people, paraquoting this here, in the front office. I personally think that matters a ton. And I'm sure we'll get into that. But where do you think that he's more valuable, in the dugout or in the front office? What do you say?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough because if Andy wasn't prior in player development, I would say, if it ain't broke, why fix it? Keep him exactly where he is. But because it's kind of a unique thing where he's already been in the organization a couple of years, knows the farm unbelievably well, has been one of the positives in the Mets player development front that we've seen under Stearns over the past 2.5 years.
Yep.
There's rightful arguments from both sides of the coin here. Now, let's talk for a bit on manager. As awesome as Andy has been as manager for this team so far, bringing us back to our point, would he be having the same level of success if the Mets had the pressure and expectation that they did at the inception of the year? And that's something that we will not have an answer to, right? And
Right.
given that gray area and uncertainty, I think there's a fair argument to suggest that Andy moving back to the front office is still best for this team. Now, what exactly that role will be, we'll talk about here in a second. But I think another part of the reason why I am content with this is because of the fact that Andy will be staying in the organization, and because of the likely role that he will have will be one that most certainly has an impact on players, and which he's still communicating with them on the day-to-day and still clearly a part of their daily processes. Not to the same degree as manager, but still will be around. And I think that's very important. Then we add in the layer of, okay, if Andy Green is not manager next year, who is going to be? Well, the common consensus, having spoken to multiple reporters across the game, very, very high up reporters. We're talking, again, the people that you and I know very well. And
Mm-hmm.
I have yet to hear from a single individual that isn't pretty much 80 to 90% confident that Carlos Beltran won't be the manager next year. There is a widespread belief that Beltran is going to be that guy, barring changes. And when Carlos states himself to media not even a month ago that I was essentially offered the job, turned it down because I have utmost respect for Mendoza, I would like to wait until the offseason and really take time to let me think with my family. I mean, the writing's on the wall there. Unless the Mets have a completely drastic thought process from then until we reach the offseason, I'm expecting Carlos Beltran to be this team's next manager. And if it's not going to be him, there's a couple other guys in that conversation. You have one of the best hitting talents of all time, Albert Pujols, on MLB Network, saying, I would like to be the Mets manager. Then you also have David Ross. And this is a really important thing to bear in mind. He hasn't been talked about much. David is on record here with the Post just over the past month or two stating, I would love to have my name thrown in that conversation.
Yep.
And who is one individual in the Mets organization that will go to bat and advocate for David Ross more than anyone else? It's Andy Green, who was his bench coach with David during their time in
Mm-hmm.
Chicago. So I think that's another layer to think about with this. If we see Andy go back to the front office and potentially in a different role, you don't think that David Ross is going to maybe have a little bit of a leg up for that managerial position if we're talking about familiarity?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. How David can handle a market like New York, that's a completely separate question that I'm sure Andy knows a better answer to than anyone else. So I'll leave that as a question mark for now. But then you also have, again, Alex Cora, who has a track record, but is going to need the bag. Are the Mets willing to give a guy like him north of $10+ million a year to make him the highest paid manager in MLB history and say, hey, you're going to be our guy moving forward? The point that I'm trying to make is that the Mets have options outside of Andy Green. Whereas
Right.
when we look at front office role, it's not like you can just put anyone in certain positions. And Andy has shown his value already in player development. Now that we've kind of come to the conclusion, it looks like Andy, as much as we like what he's doing for manager, you want to put an asterisk with it because of the lack of expectation now this season, right?
Yeah.
And knowing that there are other options out there to varying degrees that could be pretty good, if not maybe even better than Andy in that position. Time will tell. That brings us to our main point here, Dex.
Yep.
Should Andy Green go back in this Mets front office? What position is he going to be in?
Yeah. To me, it did the answer to this, and this also came out in some of the reporting by Chelsea Janes and Will Salmon. Um, and nobody's saying this exactly, but if you start reading the tea leaves, as I like to say, right, you start looking at some things, and you think about the fact that the Mets do not have a general manager. David Stearns doesn't really have somebody right under him as president of baseball operations. Steve Cohen has talked about wanting to fill that role for a couple of years now. The Mets have not done that. Why not Andy Green? Now, someone would say, hey, he's been in the front office, he's been in player development. What's the role of a general manager if you're working under David Stearns? Well, David Stearns is going to need somebody who understands the player development. You can communicate with these players on a day-to-day. General managers do that. General managers' roles can differ and vary from different teams in how they're sort of doing their role, depending on who's above them or underneath them. But as a general manager, he can be active in trade discussions. He knows the players. He understands what the Mets needs. He can be very helpful as a voice in hiring a manager, right? This is something you couldn't see. It wouldn't shock me if the Mets named Andy Green general manager right after the season is over. And then you see that he's part of the hiring search to bring someone in. So when you mention like a David Ross, well, he's going to have a very good input because he's going to say, hey, I sat in that role as an interim manager. I see some of these core players around the New York Mets. What kind of manager do we need in here? Does manager X have the temperament to handle New York? Will he be able to handle these players? This player needs this, that player needs that. We're talking about the people stuff. All these things matter in terms of doing it. So for me, it feels like the natural fit for him would be that general manager's role, right? And I think the Mets, if you just hear what I talked about earlier, that Chelsea Janes and Will Salmon both talked about in the fact that they're looking to add more baseball people into the front office. Well, why not bring a guy who understands development of talent, who then also has had managerial experience, understands the game from inside the dugout, inside the clubhouse, right? Not just looking solely at numbers. And Wardy and I are guys who like analytics, but we're not solely about it. Some of it you need to feel, some of it you need to understand people and all that stuff when it comes to managing. Well, you've got a guy in Andy Green who does that. And if you could bring that diversity of voice into the front office in terms of the baseball skill set, I think that would be really dope. I think that's a great place for him to go to. Because you look, also, let's be fair. The man stepped in and did this job, and we are talking about this with an asterisk. We are talking about this with nuance and looking at how he stepped into this job and where the Mets are. But he has got experience and now can bring a perspective back to the front office for this specific organization that he didn't necessarily have before. And I think if the Mets are valuing good people, and I think good organizations do that and understand how you can uplift them and empower them to be the best versions of themselves that can fit your organization, I think they should look at Andy Green as general manager. And I think he could be a really good fit to be another voice to maybe balance your boy, David Stearns. Maybe
You son of a gun.
yeah. I try to find any way I could make somebody
I know.
Wardy their boy. But Wardy, you've had criticisms. In all seriousness, you've had criticisms of Stearns as well too. And I wonder if a mindset that Green appears to have, my friend, is one that can sort of balance Stearns when it comes to offseason decision making that goes even beyond hiring the manager, right? What players are going to come in here and fit, because he's had a real sense of being in the clubhouse and around these guys. I think a voice in his perspective could matter here. What do you say?
Oh, absolutely. And I think all the way back to what was the initial plan when David Stearns became president? And that was for
Hmm.
Billy Epler to stay as his team's GM, at least for the first year
Year.
as Stearns was here, and then we have to have this little whistleblower be like, oh no, he's doing the Phantom IL, which every team in
I,
baseball does, but
I
because
love the
Billy
voice.
Epler does
I
it.
love the voice you just did there.
Like
The
literally,
whistleblower.
I'm sure that's how that guy sounded too when he relayed the information as well in the exclusive. But like in all seriousness, that was unfortunate. And to see Epler, out of the organization when he and David were both mutually looking forward to working together, it's a shame because now Epler, funny enough, is in the front office of the Brewers and having plenty of success
Right.
there with Matt Arnold in ways that he would probably be having with David Stearns right now. And what is one thing, and not to make this a whole Billy Epler show, because he was far from perfect as a GM, but one thing that he did figure out rather quickly in ways that Zach Scott was not able to do as like his first and only time as a GM in Major League Baseball is to properly allocate dollars, right? Even though that not every move that Epler made was the right move in the organization, there was an emphasis to spend the money that Steve wanted to spend and to do it at an aggressive level. And I respected that. And you saw Billy's aggressiveness, especially because there was a lack of I think, confirmation that he was going to be here beyond a certain period of time with David looming and with, it being a success type of thing. If you don't have success in this market, you can't expect to be here long, right? So either way, Epler isn't here. David becomes president, and his first 2.5, 3 years as president, we can all agree, has been a colossal failure from the stance of player evaluation and your return on investment. When it comes to player development, when it comes to scouting, that is not something that David Stearns has fallen short on for the most part. That's a
Right.
stronghold similar to what he did in Milwaukee. But there has been a massive adjustment that he's still learning on the fly and how to handle this market, how to handle the dollars that Steve bestows upon him, and to understand that the expectation here is not the same as what it was in small market Milwaukee. And we've seen him operate still, unfortunately, in that small market mentality when looking at the numbers, when looking at risk management and risk far outweighing the reward in many cases of moves he's made the past year and a half, 2 years. So it now begs the question, is now the time to finally have David's paws just a little off of all the transactions and allow someone here who can not only relay the voice as a former player and as an active mind in the organization, but someone that, again, can, like what he did with the players, could do further with David. And that's giving a different voice and a change in direction, maybe from how David has had his processes with the people around him prior. Because if the Mets really want to add more actual ball players, athletes in this mix, it goes without saying that's in hand because of where their shortcomings have been with people around David that maybe are too much of analytical ilk, are too in-depth in the numbers, and maybe not emphasizing enough on the feel that you need for today's game. And no better person to understand the feel in today's game than a former player himself and someone like Mr. Green. So when you think about how the Mets envisioned their front office to be when Stearns first became president to how it's never been that way since he came here, this is just something that's long overdue. This should have been happening, right? So, it's better late than never, I suppose. But yeah, listen, this is less reading the tea leaves as it is Dex. It's a foregone conclusion. Andy Green's going to be the Mets GM next year. That's what's going to happen. That's 1,000% what's going to happen. There isn't a doubt in my mind that he's going to be the general manager for this club, and I think it makes too much sense. It makes so much sense. Especially when you look at the player development aspect. You think of his relationship with the young players. You think of his relationship with players on the team right now. How do you think the players will feel knowing that it's him, a guy that they were just managed by a half season ago, is now the one kind of pulling the strings? I don't think that would bother most players on this team, with maybe the exception of Mark Vientos, right? And it's kind of interesting when we hear this remark from Andy Green.
If Mark Vientos is bothered, then I mean, get out.
You get what I'm saying.
I know what you mean.
Andy perfectly worded it in a way to suggest that Mark will likely not be here after the conclusion of this season, which
Yeah,
is why he's not getting much runway. He articulated in a way that was very professional, is the way I'm trying to explain.
absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
but the point here stands. Andy's 1,000% going to be the Mets' next GM. And I think that is finally going to bring stability and structure to a front office that has fallen so unbelievably short and meeting that yearly expectation under Cohen.
Listen, it it makes too much sense. Sometimes I get nervous when things make too much sense because then it doesn't happen
I
because it
know.
makes too much sense, right?
Yeah, that's
Um,
fair. Yeah.
yeah, if the Mets, I think if the Met, look, I'm not saying that we know everything and we're looking at everything in the perfect ways because we've had things we got right and things we got wrong. You could look this season, you could go back to our X Factors this season and see things we got right and we got wrong. But
Yeah.
what I will say is if the Mets are valuing the same things that we seem to value here, right? Then sure, it would make sense. It just feels like it makes too much sense. If they value the diversity of thought in the front office, then this is the right move. If they value, I'm a big believer also in continuity and connectivity. I think when you have that in an organization and teams, I think that matters. So maybe someone will say to me, well, hey, Dex, hey, Wardy, don't you want him to continue as Mets manager? Continuity is not just in the dugout. The continuity of him being around the organization, the continuity of him still talking to the players on a daily basis, which general managers do. If you go around, Wardy and I have been around this team. We've been around the field, for batting practice, whatever sport is you cover. General managers, they're still always nurturing relationships. They're talking to agents, they are talking to family members, they are talking to players as well too, seeing how they're doing. Conversations they could then maybe go back and relate to the managers. They're talking to their managers every day. It's understanding the flow, what's working in the clubhouse, what's not working in the clubhouse, who's happy, who's unhappy. How can we get everybody on the same page? What's the vibe? Somebody that knows the culture of the clubhouse, that knows who the leaders and who are not the leaders in there, and then can talk to a David Stearns about that and say, this may be a little bit more of what we need here. I think that matters a ton. Look, I also think something else you said I will address here. I think I'd be very stunned if Carlos Beltran is not a high candidate for this next Mets job. Um, in talking to people, as you have too, this seems very likely you will be one of these candidates for the job. And talking to some folks around the Mets about that, I think a lot of Mets fans would like that. I think it would be good for Carlos. It sounds to me like between you and I, we've got the Mets manager and general manager picked out already in late August. Who would have thought?
Just by paying attention, Dex. That's all you got to do. Just pay attention, because unless the team come the offseason says we're 180ing all this, which maybe they will. Who knows? I won't put anything past the Mets to surprise us in ways that we maybe like or most certainly dislike.
I,
But from what we've seen, Dex, I think we're trending in exactly that direction.
right,
Beltran barring changes. Maybe David Ross comes, but maybe David Ross is his bench guy. Who knows? Who
things
knows?
a lot can change between now and the off season. I won't say any definitives. I would just say I would be stunned if Carlos Beltran is not a high candidate for the Mets to get the Mets manager. By high level, I mean like be stunned if he's not a finalist for the job, is what I mean there.
Yeah, if
Andy
he's not a
Green,
finalist for the job, something has to happen. Like, or someone becomes available that we maybe didn't think would become
right?
available.
I
Had to be
that's
something along those
and I'll
lines.
always give that percentage of a chance there, or let's just say the Mets are really enamored with getting Alex Cora and they feel like they can give him the bag and they're cool with that. I think that's possible too. There's possibilities there. If you ask me of the two, what I think is the more likely, sure, I actually think it's Andy Green being general manager is probably maybe the more thing I'd probably see because I just think there's a clearer path to that.
I agree.
But look, we'll see. I know there are fans who want Andy Green to manage the Mets in 2027. uh, I understand where you're coming from, but I will still curb the enthusiasm, as I said earlier, and pump the brakes and say it's one thing to be an interim manager. It's another thing to manage the New York Mets in 2027, if there is baseball, where there is going to be real expectations where the Mets are trying to win and get back to the playoffs again, which they said they wanted this year. The expectations are going to be real. I'm not saying that Andy Green can't handle that. It's not my point. I'm just saying it's a different ball game. You're almost playing a different game, right? And you might look at that and say, "Oh, this The results look like Carlos Mendoza. I don't think he carries himself the same way as Carlos Mendoza did, but the results are different. Now, we'll say this. Last thing we wrap to something you brought up, and I agree with you so much. The way Andy Green handles situations, like even the Vientos question when asked, the way he carries himself, I do think that stuff matters. And I don't think it just matters for being a manager. I think it also really matters in the front office because as a general manager, he's somebody else that can talk to the media. David Stearns will be the more front facing guy on that. But when he has to talk, or if he does need to talk about players, and it's going to matter because he's done it before. And listen, when you're coaching, managing in this market in New York, or you're a president of baseball operations, or you're an owner, how you handle the media and answer questions matters a ton. If you can't handle the tough questions, if you can't show that you're going to hold players accountable, if you don't give the same stock answer, fans are just going to say one ear out the other. I just watched it. Everybody knows here I cover the Knicks, and Mike Brown was refreshing to cover this past year in his press conferences because he didn't give a stock answer. He would tell you the truth. He would tell you if guys needed to play better. He would tell you who was holding accountable. He would explain to you what was going wrong. And listen, it's not just about catering to me as a media member or anybody else or even the fans. Fans want transparency. They want winning, but they want transparency.
They just
And
want
I
you to be
think
real. That's the
just
most
be real.
important thing.
You
Yep.
could we can see it. We got eyes. You don't have to spit in our face and call it rain. We could see what's going on. So the transparency part matters. And you know what? The Mets can use a little bit of transparency, Wardy, all around. From the dugout to the front office. Mets fans would like to see that along with the winning. So I'm with you, my friend. I would love to see Andy Green as general manager. I think he's shown good qualities that Mets fans should be excited about. And good for him. Good for him for making the most of his opportunity, no matter what happens for his time in the dugout.
Absolutely. And to put a bow on this, let's not forget how Andy came into position as player development, right? This was after David Ross was parted ways with by the Cubs because they were bringing in Craig Counsell on that new big contract. The Mets had interest in Counsell prior because of the Stearns Counsell connection in Milwaukee. Didn't work out. And that's fine because Craig does not strike me as one that can handle this market whatsoever. So I'm not losing sleep over that at all. And PCA is carrying that team right now. That's a discussion for another day. But point here is that Andy interviews for the managerial role, and David just sits back and he's like, man, the way that you understand the game, like you're like too valuable to, I think, even really have in the dugout. We need you in this front office. Like, can we please hire you in this front office? Like, if you want to be in player development, I think that's a perfect role for you to finally have more of this kind of one-on-one impact in players, throughout their career, maybe not just the short term that happens throughout the normal course of a season. And that should be your telltale sign right there that if Andy gets hired in that position because David views him so highly to begin, before he even does anything in the organization, has had the success that he's had in player development since then, and is now having the success that he's having as manager, again, it really just makes it an even more obvious foregone conclusion as to why he will be general manager in 2027. At the end of the day, it's going to be what David and Steve want. And if Steve wants a GM, the way that reports are suggesting, and if David knows that a GM is probably the next best option to save his ass from getting canned, because that's 1,000% true. You can't suggest otherwise. Like, if the Mets didn't have a GM entering next year and had another failure of a season in the first half, David Stearns will be fired. It's not that I want him fired necessarily or that you want him fired, but that's the reality in this market.
Yeah,
that's why you can't. That's why you have to look at it and say, okay, how can we make this team better? And where can I right my wrongs as president? And David can, I think, to a degree at least, right those wrongs by taking less pressure on his shoulders and putting them on someone who actually might have more comfortability to handle these things. Like, I love the idea of seeing Andy Green would handle a trade deadline and how he would articulate himself to media like us. Like, that's a really exciting thought, honestly, because regardless as to where the Mets would add or maybe sell, I know that Andy would properly articulate himself in a way where the fan base can understand, where we're not going to be slighted, where you have David Stearns having his usual 2-week presser and, basically giving you the same verbiage day in and day out. That would not be the case. And that alone, I think, is what fans are going to buy into. The success is important, yes, but just that transparency that we're not going to beat around the bush. I'm going to just tell you straight how it is. Okay. Like if we're playing good, I'm going to tell you why we're playing good. If we're playing bad, I'm going to tell you exactly why we're playing bad. Not to throw players under the bus, but they need to be held accountable. And between accountability and proactivity, two things that the Mets have severely lacked that we've broken down this season and in years past. It will be so refreshing and so exciting for myself, yourself, and for this entire fan base, and they can find more of that by making this type of move. So I'm with you. Andy Green and Carlos Mendoza, cue it as your little, political tag for 2027. That's what I'm rocking with right now, barring
No.
change.
I got to catch yourself. You just said something that you caught yourself. You did not say what you wanted to say. You just said Andy Green and Carlos Mendoza as your political tag for 2027.
Oh God, yeah,
you
no,
did
cut
not.
that
you
out.
do not want
cut
that. I was like, Gordy, you do not want that at all. I'm like, what are you doing here?
Nothing personal, Mendy, but no, respectfully,
you meant
no.
Carlos
We need the other Carl. We need the Hall of Fame Carlson here. Respectfully, that's who we need. Okay, I need Carlos Beltran and I need Andy Green. There we go. Cut it out. I hope you guys cut it out.
That is going in the Straight Outta Flushing outtake Hall of Fame there, because that is not what Wardy meant at all whatsoever. Yeah, that is not what you wanted. Hey, it's been 40 years since the Mets last won a World Series title. Mets fans have no time for the lack of transparency. Nobody's got time for that.
Imagine trying to BS diehard fans of 40 plus years. Imagine, and yet we still do it. Like as an organization, it's baffling to me. It's like, okay, see how that's going to work with the fan base. Go ahead.
I think people are ready. It's going to be intriguing to see. What all this said, this is why it's fun to talk about. We'll see what the next chapter of Mets baseball and leadership looks like. It's going to be very interesting to see. Maybe it'll be Carlos Beltran. I almost called myself and said Carlos Mendoza as well, and Andy Green. The political.
Oh ticket. God, it's terrible. It's like when you're calling your new girl your ex's name by accident. You can't.
That has never happened to me. I hope that's never happened to you.
Dex, you can't do it. No, can't do it.
You know what, Wardy? I hope. That's a rough situation, my friend. That is a rough situation. You don't want to be. That is hot water you don't want to be in. Don't do that. Don't do it. You might get a pass early on, but you get a little deeper into the relationship. That's a tough one. That is a tough one. All right.
Yeah. Don't say it while she's walking down the aisle. That's my suggestion.
Oh God, now you just gave me the nightmare situation of all nightmare situations. There, woo, that's terrible. You have a lot of things in your mind. Yeah, you know what? This is a great place. This is a great place to end. That is a disaster of a situation. All right, that's going to do it for this edition of Straight Outta Flushing. It's my guy Wardy who wants Carlos Beltran and Andy Green for 2027.
Damn right.
We can make sure that we got it right. Let us know in the comments what you think. What should the next role be for Andy Green? Should it be him in the dugout as manager? Do you think that he should go to the front office and possibly be in the general manager's role? What do you think? Should he just stay in player development? What do you think should be the next role for Andy Green? That's my guy, Wardy. I'm Dexter Henry. We'll catch you next time on another edition of Straight Outta Flushing. Peace, everybody.